Nick Majerison here. This is the TopMedTalk Top 10, and this series is a chance for new listeners to jump on board and for established listeners to catch up with some of our favourite podcasts so far in terms of downloads. We're playing them out in no particular order, and this is one of our top 10 podcasts ever done. It's one of our famous deep dives and one of the most popular pieces we've ever made. No surprise, as it deals with one of the biggest stories of the year for us. It's the Relief Trial, your essential deep dive into the results. Let's have a listen.
Top Med Talk. So we managed to catch up with Paul Myles. Now you can probably hear the chatter in the background. We're just in the receiving area, the reception area at the British Museum, where the main sessions of the day have finished. And Paul Myles has very generously agreed to come and join us and do a follow-up on the results of the Relief Trial. So Paul, welcome back.
Thanks, Monty.
So we caught you relatively recently off the stage in Sydney. Top Med Talk were there.
Yes.
I thrust an orange microphone into your face and you gave us the headline results.
Yes.
Which we're all clear on now, I think. Moderately liberal compared to what was restricted in the trial, produced a better outcome from the point of view of some of the short-term variables, but the long-term variables were not different. Just repackage it again for us the way you see it. The headline again.
Right,
I know I've done this a few times, but people are still a little bit confused.
Okay, so I guess I'll start with the conclusion. Our view is that a moderately liberal IV fluid strategy is the optimum for the average patient having major abdominal surgery. And we came to that conclusion because we were actually interested in and believing that a more restrictive regimen would be better, based on some of the smaller studies that have been done. And that was really because there was a bit of a signal coming through that there was less complications overall and a shorter hospital length of stay with less IV fluid.
So just want to challenge you on that. From personally, Paul, from working from first principles, why would you think that running someone dry would be better for you?
Well, not running dry,
Okay.
and this is to clarify, when we use the phrase restrictive and liberal, that means different things to different people. For us, a restrictive regimen was aiming for zero balance. So it was roughly a zero balance, so providing enough fluid to maintain what we believe would be sort of a fluid homeostasis versus a more traditional approach, which was what is a moderately liberal approach by today's standards.
And us re-exploring the data in some detail earlier, I think we all concluded, I'll let the guys come in a second now, I've got Mike Grocott here and Joff Lacey back with me, that in the so-called restricted group, they hit what looks like a zero balance. Mike?
Zero balance or pretty close, within a litre or so.
Yeah, so we were wanting to demonstrate that that's what we were doing, and the last thing we wanted to do was to be criticised for being too restrictive, equally too liberal, because if either of those groups was shown to be harmful, of course we'd get criticised. So that was always in the back of our minds right from the start of the design of the study. So we collected all fluid inputs and outputs during surgery and out to 24 hours, and we calculated the fluid balance through that period, and equally on patients that we could weigh, we weighed them on days 1, 2 and 3 after surgery.
And they were the restricted group, they were slightly up on weight. So the gold standard says, whichever way you look at it, you've already probably had a bit taken away, which is in the literature. You may have had a tumour taken away or something.
Yes.
You can't say that they would appear to be very dry.
Exactly right.
Yeah.
So I think feel very confident that we could strongly defend that what we've labelled as a restrictive group was in fact a zero balance group, or close to zero balance, and if anything was on the numbers slightly positive, but only by a small amount.
And we reflected earlier that some of the observational studies that we've seen, some that we've been involved with, there are huge outliers compared to what you've examined. There are the kind of very, very positive, the 5+ litres positive, and there are the what appear to be very, very dry, and it's not there. It's in this bit in the middle that looks like traditionally regarded a safe zone, and it's at the drier and wetter end of that safe zone.
Correct. And it was really for us to put a number on where that sort of nadir is in the Mark Bellamy curve, which I think many people are familiar with. That's sort of the Goldilocks amount of not too little and not too much. And we've now got a number there that wasn't there, and that number, of course, must remain flexible according to an individual patient's response and fluid fluxes during any type of surgery.
So Joff, you were with Paul when we went into this in prep in Boston at the ASA, as Mike was as well. Do you think we've got that right now? We're interpreting it. Do we agree with Paul's interpretation of the data he's been involved in collecting?
Do I agree with Paul?
Yeah. Well,
yes.
Of course you do.
Is the answer to that?
Okay. Is there any confusion
Game
left?
on.
Is there any confusion left about this point? I know we've tortured it, but a lot of people, there's been a lot of stuff out there about,
Well, I think Paul alluded to the point that the phrase liberal and restrictive does mean different things to different people, and that may be where a lot of the frisson kind of comes from. But I think when you break it down and take a deep dive and know exactly what they mean and where it's established, then yes, as you say repeatedly, that kind of sweet spot of zero balance, slightly positive, seems to be within the realms where everyone kind of has an agreement, I would say.
Great stuff. So, Paul, we're in the same space there, which is great. So we cut you off, Paul. The other outcome variables that appeared to not favour the restricted group.
Okay, so this is, I guess, why we're recommending a moderately liberal approach, was that, in fact, we identified a very strong harm signal, particularly for acute kidney injury. And I think, although these are secondary endpoints, they were pre-specified, and the AKI result is very robust and highly statistically significant, and therefore I think we can accept as a true finding. The other harm signals that we found were related to surgical site infection, particularly deep organ space infection, which are serious infections. Yeah. And that's a sort of a consistent even with the anastomotic leak data that was also found in the study. And the other one, of course, is the need for renal replacement therapy out to 90 days after surgery. Again, coherent, consistent with the acute kidney injury data, the oliguria, the anuria, the low urine output that was happening in the patients in that zero balance group. So on the basis that we could not identify any positive feature whatsoever from the restrictive zero balance group, and some very clear, consistent, coherent harm signals, that's why we have this recommendation.
So Mike, taking a helicopter view, you've been involved in leading a lot of the meta-analyses of fluid-related trials. We'll come back to the goal-directed monitoring bit in a second. Those outcome variables are recurring themes. So it's the biggest trial ever, but compared to the meta-analyses, the infection and the AKI are recurring themes.
They are.
Correct.
They occur consistently. You've just stopped me from mentioning anything to do with goal-directed fluid therapy, but they're consistent signals across the literature, where typically a little more is given rather than a little less. A whole variety of different ways that's achieved.
Yeah. And the biology behind that, the theories as to why that might happen, they all have face validity. They make sense to me.
Yes.
But they're not as though they're crazy things that happen that, hang on.
Well, I think that's right. And this is really why I set out to do this trial in the first instance, because we knew that if we were going to limit the amount of IV fluid we give, which was the traditional approach that I'd been trained with, and I think many anaesthetists or anaesthesiologists around the world have been trained with, then we got, okay, well, how do we deal with the predictable hypotension that will happen during surgery and equally in the recovery room and even back on the wards after surgery? And, it seems so simple and easy to give that extra fluid challenge or IV fluids. If we have to deal with this differently, how do we go about doing that? And you basically are obliged to use some sort of vasopressor therapy or just tolerate the hypotension. And to me, all of a sudden, I think my anaesthetic is becoming a little bit more complicated. And I didn't think it was a valid evidence-based move in our practice to do that without compelling evidence.
Right.
And I didn't believe that compelling evidence was there. I liked the theory. Yeah. I was worried about tissue edema and wound healing and so on. So I thought it was a live issue. We had equipoise and the study needed to be done.
And I think we all agreed, everyone's agreed, from the point of view of landing with randomisation, everything that's required to answer the question, big thank you for all of that. Everyone says, great, well done, remarkably perhaps. So, Joff, you had a question that related to the types of fluids. Now, there may be deep in the paper and we haven't had a chance to read it all yet, or it may be in secondary analyses, but what was your question, Joff?
It was, I understand that in the post-operative phase, the use of other types of fluid was at the discretion of the local policy. So whether that was crystalloid or colloids or whatever, it was left up to them to do it. I was just wondering whether you knew if there was any differences between the groups in terms of what types of fluid were used, and whether that could necessarily have muddied waters, or what your opinion was on that.
Okay, yeah, so we did collect very complete and accurate data about all types of IV fluids, whether it was colloid, crystalloid, whether it was a balanced salt solution or a
dextrose or whatever,
and so on. And even uses of starches. Now, we recommended not using starch-based solutions in the study, given the evidence that we had at that time. Yeah. Equally, we were favouring a balanced salt crystalloid solution as the general solution, because there's a separate debate around fluids, colloids versus crystalloids, and I think that remains partly an open question. And really, there's not much out there that would support a colloid over a crystalloid. Certainly, that's my reading of the literature. So balanced salt solutions were recommended both intraoperatively and postoperatively, but we allowed local use of alternative fluids if that was their practice, and we just collected that data. At the end of the day, there was literally only in 3,000 patients, only really a handful of patients that got any starch-based solution. So we were actually pleased with that. Yeah. Because this trial was run across 7 different countries and I think 46 hospitals, so that's quite extraordinary, really. Colloids, of course, were used, and that was a mix of gelatin-based solutions or albumin. Albumin's the commonest solution used in Australia and New Zealand, but I know gelatins and even starch-based solutions are often used elsewhere. But we collected that information and we analysed for it. And equally with the saline-based and even the dextrose-based solutions, of which we use in a very, very small proportion of patients. Now, when you looked at the types of fluid separately and the volumes of each type of fluid, they were completely balanced, pardon the pun, in both groups.
Oh, really?
And that, in fact, it's one of the great features of a large randomised trial, in that both known and unknown variables or confounding factors will get balanced. It's the law of large numbers. It's why I like doing these trials. Equally, with a large data set, you can actually do more meaningful subgroup analyses. We could analyse the data without the starch patients, without the normal saline patients. Results simply don't change.
Mike, you had a question with regards to the vasopressors being used more frequently in the restricted group and blood pressure management in general.
So I'm intrigued. So in the context of another live debate in perioperative care, where we've recently, I guess, refocused on blood pressure control.
Yes.
And restrictive liberal, in a group getting less fluid, it wouldn't be a surprise if there was more vasopressor use. And from my reading of the paper, that there's a statistically significant increase in vasopressor use in the restrictive group, which makes good sense. What do you think the clinical significance of that is? And do you have any more detail on the... so was that boluses? Was it infusions? Were the levels of hypotension or the frequency of hypotensive events, was that different between groups?
Yeah, so again, that was, as I said right at the, earlier on, that concern for hypotension was certainly at the front of my mind in designing the study. We collect all the relevant hemodynamics, both during the surgery and in the recovery room and post-operatively. We collected data on highest and lowest heart rate, highest and lowest systolic blood pressure, and mean blood pressure and so on, to see whether or not... And we also asked the anaesthetist to actually pre-specify what their target blood pressure would be before induction of anaesthesia, so that we could get a sense of, that they wouldn't be biased in any way. Because the anaesthetist, of course, had to know what fluids were being used, what group the patients were in. And quite surprisingly, the differences in hemodynamics were really trivial. That, in fact, although there was a very small, statistically significant lower systolic blood pressure during the operation, that didn't play out to the recovery room and beyond. There was no differences in heart rate or mean blood pressures. So I think basically anaesthetists did treat the patients the same in all other respects. So that's, I think, again, a good feature of the trial design. We knew they were likely to need vasopressor. A reminder that the patients that went in this trial had risk factors. They were higher risk patients having more, fairly major abdominal surgery. Esophagectomies, Whipple's procedures, major abdominal surgery. We anticipated a large proportion would require at least some vasopressor during surgery. That's really part of that for any anaesthetist practice.
Over 80%?
So around about 80% got some vasopressor. So that wouldn't surprise people. But of course, you can give a few increments of metaraminol or phenylephrine. That's different to running a high-dose adrenaline or noradrenaline infusion.
Do you know how many ended up on infusions off the bat?
We didn't collect extensive data on this because, again, we didn't want to put too much burden on. There was a lot of data collected, but we had to be a bit lean. But what we can say is that the proportion of patients who ended up on like a vasopressor infusion, particularly into the post-operative phase, was really in the order of around about 5% or so quite low. Okay. Again, given the high-risk population, at least 10% were in the intensive care unit post-operatively. There was a slightly higher need in the restrictive zero balance group, but it was only it wasn't statistically significant. I don't think it might have been borderline, but we're talking, I think, something like 3 versus 6%. It was very small.
Right, and taking on board what you say about trying to avoid the burden of data collection, but do you have any feel for the volatility in blood pressure that there might have been any difference between the two groups?
Not really. I mean, we didn't collect extensive hemodynamics through the operation. We literally asked for the highest and lowest persistent heart rates, blood pressures during surgery and also in the recovery room. So my view is that for a well-trained anaesthetist to deal with transient increases, decreases in blood pressure is just part of the deal. It's so trivial, it's of no consequence to the patient themselves. We wouldn't tolerate extremes of that, particularly for longer periods, and that simply didn't occur, and nor did we expect it. But all I can say is it seems that the sort of maintenance of the hemodynamics was a very minor issue, I think, for both the anaesthetist during surgery and also for the staff caring for them post-operatively.
So we've got two last areas to cover off, and I think the team are hovering to throw us out of here soon, so we'll may have to take it to another venue. But Paul, you touched on it in your presentations, and the way I interpreted it was, I know you're a fan of enhanced recovery principles.
Yes.
Is that where there appeared to be claimed adoption of enhanced recovery principles, it didn't protect from the effects that were seen in the restrictive group related to RCoA infection, etc. Is that roughly speaking?
That is correct, and I think this is an important finding from the study. I do want to emphasise that my personal view is that enhanced recovery after surgery or ERAS pathways are incredibly valuable part of modern care of surgical patients. So I strongly believe in ERAS and ERAS principles. One of those principles was a more restrictive IV fluid therapy approach, and I think some of the ERAS principles deserve evaluation in a randomised trial. Others are already fully established based on very good evidence. We strongly encouraged ERAS principles for all patients in the trial. We knew that this international trial would have centres that would be high adopters of such techniques and others who literally either don't do it, don't believe in it, or have variable practices. So once again, we collected all the relevant ERAS behaviours that were used by the surgical and anaesthesia teams during and after surgery. And we actually analysed for those ERAS principles that are not affected or not relevant to the post-operative period. In other words, the baseline or intraoperative variables, for instance, use of a nasogastric tube, avoiding prolonged fasting and dehydration. These principles are all collected, and when you look at either a single item, any particular item of ERAS principles, or those that used a lot of them versus minimal of them, the signal was entirely consistently the same. In other words, the effect, the harmful effect of a zero balance approach existed in those settings that had high ERAS behaviours versus low ERAS behaviours. So I think, again, we can be very confident that the findings are relevant in a range of clinical circumstances, ERAS settings or otherwise.
So Desiree, this is one of your questions, because you do a lot of lecturing about this in the United States of America, around the world, and you're going to be asked quite a lot about this. Any more from Paul that you need to know to be able to answer some of those questions from your perspective?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, if someone's not utilizing goal-directed fluid therapy, which I know we're going to talk about here in just a little bit, we talk about individualization of fluid therapy, but many people just say they're going to fluid restrict their patient, and that's part of their ERAS protocol. Or we see in published protocol zero fluid balance. So as a recommendation from this, I mean, should we say now, no, we're going to modify, this is a modifiable aspect and component to an enhanced recovery pathway? I mean, is that something we need to start changing that conversation?
Yeah, I don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. I think ERAS and ERAS principles remain incredibly important. But that one item of giving a more restrictive IV fluid approach, I think needs to be changed. Mm-hmm. I think we need to give a more moderately liberal, not excessively liberal, but a moderately liberal fluid strategy as a background. Now, I remain a supporter of individualised care. Mm-hmm. So if there are individual circumstances, if for some reason that particular patient will be at risk or seems to be at risk of, say, of pulmonary edema or heart failure and so on, then I think we should hold back on those fluids further than the average patient. Equally, a person that seems to be hypotensive deserves a fluid challenge and a second fluid challenge and reassessment. These are already part of most ERAS programs in any case, and I think they remain the same. All I would say from our trial is that on that one item, we need to be more moderately liberal than perhaps we have been in the last few years.
So Paul, our national consensus statement said about sort of +1 to +2, very crudely, was sort of what we perceived to be the zone of safety. It was a consensus based on lack of evidence,
yes,
but kind of like how to make a pragmatic, state-of-the-art recommendation based on no evidence.
Yes.
Is that reasonable? In other words,
yep.
Just don't keep an eye on it all.
Yes.
And if you end up +1 to +2, don't feel terrible.
Yeah.
But be careful about being too close to zero, and definitely don't go up from there.
Yeah, so I think +1 to +2 litres is actually a sweet spot.
Yeah.
Roughly 24 hours after surgery.
Yeah.
That to me is about the sweet spot, even perhaps a little more,
yeah,
but not a lot more.
Yeah.
If you're only at zero balance or 500 mils positive, I think the patients are probably, or that approach is putting the patient at risk, particularly of acute kidney injury, probably other complications.
You want to turn to that, Mike?
Well, just the whole issue of terminology we've discussed ad nauseum is difficult, but I'm reminded. So Henrik Keller, the father of enhanced recovery, arguably if there was a Nobel Prize for clinical medicine and innovation, he probably should get one. As I recall, he didn't talk about fluid restriction. He talked about avoidance of fluid excess, and he pretty much is where you are at the moment, I think.
Well, Henrik and I have very hotly contested debates on many occasions, but what surprises me is we agree on so much. So in this case, I think that remains an important message. I think I also strongly believe that we should avoid fluid excess, or chasing hypotension with more and more fluid when in fact there is no obvious responsiveness from the patient, that in fact they need other therapies, often admission to critical care, to be more finely tuned in their care. I think we should move away from the phrase zero balance.
Yeah.
I think to a moderately liberal approach is the right way, but continue to avoid excessive fluids.
Which brings us to our last subject area. So Mike asked you the question at the ASA in Boston about the goal-directed approach, the use of advanced hemodynamic monitoring, cardiac output monitors, and also mixed in with that whether you're using actively hemodynamic management algorithms. And you said, I think, that you'd backed away because of the various different reasons for a factorial design that aimed to address all those issues with adequate power.
Yeah.
But let the subset opportunities run. Now, we kicked that around earlier,
yes,
and we're still a little bit confused as to what that means. So we get the impression there's a subset that had monitors put on, but were they monitored or managed with those?
Well, I think the great news is I'm going to reassure you about your confusion. So the trial, we initially thought about a factorial trial and randomly assign a goal-directed device and a management algorithm along with the fluid restriction or liberal approach, but it was found or seen to be a bit too complex and too difficult. So we collected data on whether or not a goal-directed device was used or not, and we did not count a central venous catheter or CVP monitoring as one of those devices. And we asked the anaesthetist to, again, pre-specify what their threshold was for giving a fluid challenge or a fluid bolus on the assessment of what that person would be as a fluid responder. And, of course, it varied according to whether it was esophageal Doppler or one of the pulse wave analyzer devices. So we've got that data, and we've got a lot of data, and we will be doing a secondary paper around that information. Like the ERAS story, all I can say at this point in time is that whether or not such a device was used, and whether or not an algorithm was followed more strictly or otherwise, the findings are unchanged. So a restrictive fluid approach aiming for a zero balance remains harmful whether or not a fluid responsive device monitor was being used. Now, like ERAS, that does not mean that these devices are unhelpful or it doesn't work. We have not evaluated the use of those devices at all. What we will be able to do is see whether or not there's some patterns that come through in when they were used, of whether or not there was any risk mitigation or not in certain types of patients.
To press you on this point, you haven't evaluated whether a hemodynamic algorithm has been applied effectively to achieve certain goals of whatever they're chosen to be, blood pressure, cardiac index, DO2. You'll have some suggestions, we hope, in your subset analyses, but you haven't specifically addressed that point.
We've collected the data to see whether or not they did achieve their goals.
Yeah, gotcha.
But the design could not test the effectiveness of such a device or even the algorithm that went with it. All we'll be able to say is, what information these devices seem to be providing around, kidney function and other outcomes.
So no, apart from the fact it doesn't protect, the application of the device doesn't appear to protect in a subset as you've described.
Yes.
We have some ongoing. The evidence base is what the evidence base is, and there is a rationale for still doing optimised 2, for example.
Exactly right. Exactly. Not just yes, but I think that's extremely important. That is a very important live question, and I think people need an open mind, and optimised 2 is a perfect way of solving that particular dilemma.
So, any last questions for Paul? We're going to obviously, this is going to run and run. I think there's going to be a lot more data.
Congratulations. It's a magnificent study.
Yeah, fantastic. Thank you so much.
Thanks very much.
Thanks for everything.
TopMedTalk. Don't forget, of course, you can meet the TopMedTalk team. All you need to do is check out our website, topmedtalk.com, and then sign up for the email updates. As soon as you've done that, you'll find out where we're going to be, where we're going to go, and where we have been. We'll also tell you when we're broadcasting live from the TopMedTalk website. So get yourself there as soon as you can, topmedtalk.com, and sign up for the email updates.